Good evening and welcome to Conversations Live, the Future of Farming. I'm Patty Satalia. By 2050, the world's population is expected to exceed 9 billion. How will we feed our hungry world? What will it take to simultaneously increase agricultural productivity and decrease its environmental impact? Tonight, our experts will discuss the future of modern agriculture, including the challenges that stand in the way. They'll also take your questions. Now let's meet our guests. David Mortensen is a professor of weed and applied plant ecology at Penn State. He also sits on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. Richard Rausch is the dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State. His research has focused on genetically modified insect-resistant crops and pesticides, as well as the biological control of pests. Troy Ott is a professor of reproductive physiology at Penn State. He's also the associate director of the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences. Thank you all so much for joining us. You can join tonight's conversation. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. You may also tweet your question or comment using the hashtag WPSUConversations. So let's get the conversation started. I'd like each of you to respond to this. What do you see as the greatest challenges? And I'll begin with you, David Mortensen, facing modern agriculture today.
Patty, I think the answer to that is very much dependent on where we are in the world. In the region that we live in Pennsylvania and the Northeast, I would say that my greatest concern is the transition of farmland, where families that are in farming in Pennsylvania and other farms in the region are able to make the transition so that the next generation is able to get involved in farming and be a part of a tradition in our country of small, medium, and larger family farms. So that transition that's occurring right now, where the demographic is that we have an aging farming
Farmers are
population.
retiring and their sons and daughters aren't taking over.
So that would be, in this region, one of my big concerns.
Okay, and for you, Professor Rausch?
Well, you've really put your finger on it. We've got to be able to feed 2, 3, 4 billion people in the next 40 years, and how are we going to do that without damaging the environment? But I think the really big challenges are going to be about water, the availability of water in the face of climate change. I lived in Australia for 17 years, and you become acutely aware of how closely tied agriculture is to water and how marginal it is in a lot of areas. But travel in India, China, Africa, wherever you go, especially since water is in great demand from urbanization, mining, manufacturing. Big challenges around water, how to adapt to climate change, how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as they come out of agriculture. Those are all, I think, really global, major global issues.
Okay, and you said 2, 3, 4 billion, but the projection for 2050 is 9 billion.
Yeah, that 2 or 3, 4 billion
more. Okay, just wanted to clarify that
right.
Before we moved on. Professor Ott.
Well, I think in addition to the sustainability challenges and the challenges of feeding the growing world population, one of the challenges I see is keeping people connected to their food systems. And I think in the past, I think people, as fewer and fewer people are farming, we have become disconnected from our food systems. And when you become disconnected, that sets up a situation where people don't understand why agriculture is doing different things. And I would like to see people engage more with agriculture and understand what we're doing, why we're doing, what are the challenges that we face.
You know, it is true that in the last 50 years, consumers have moved further and further away from the farm on one hand, but on the other hand, I think consumer interest in how their food is produced among at least a segment of the population is greater than it's ever been before.
Yeah, I would agree. And getting information out to people about the food system. People want to know everything now about how their food was produced, where it was produced, how did it get to their market, what were the components of the agricultural system that were used to produce that food, what are the health benefits of the food. So yes, people are, at least a segment of our society is much more interested in how their food is produced.
So in terms of how it's produced, I think it's interesting to note many farmers say that one of the biggest challenges today is that publicly funded agricultural research is going by the wayside. And so increasingly they're relying on the advice that's coming from industry, the people who are selling them the seeds and the herbicides and the pesticides. How great a concern. You're the Dean of the College of Agriculture, one of the biggest organizations, institutions in the country. Is that a concern?
Sure it is. And it's been a growing concern about the last 40 years. There's really clear evidence from agricultural economists that reductions in investment in public sector research result in lower productivity over time. Usually there's a lag because any kind of innovation we develop usually takes something like 7 to 10 years before it becomes widely adopted. So there's a lag, and that's made it hard for some people to recognize that there's this effect if you reduce investment in agricultural research in the public sector, that it reduces productivity gains in the field. But it's true. It's true in Australia, it's true in the United States. So this is a real challenge because it's only the public sector that'll look at the broad-based things that are in public interest. Things like a lot of what we're trying to focus on within the college now is looking at agricultural runoff to improve the quality of the rivers and streams of Pennsylvania. There's not a private sector interest in doing this. This research is going to have to be done in the public sector.
So, well, that brings me to you, David Mortensen. You're involved in integrated weed management. I think most people have heard integrated pest management, same idea. But as more and more farmers adopt genetically modified crops, it seems as if the need to have this sort of more broad-based approach to weeds or pests is to some extent going by the wayside. Tell me, maybe explain what integrated weed management is and what the concerns are around it.
Yeah, so these integrated practices, integrated pest management would be the management of weed, insect, disease, pests that occur in a cropping system. IPM, integrated pest management. The weed part of that is a subset. They're a very serious pest problem that farmers deal with year in and year out. In our corn and soybean and commodity crops, so for the folks watching this show, those are the large acreage crops. We have large acreages of those here in Pennsylvania, but we have a very diverse crop base here in Pennsylvania. I used to work in Nebraska where at the county level we would have 3 crops in the county, corn, soybean, and alfalfa, or sorghum, soybean, and alfalfa. In contrast, Pennsylvania has roughly 50 crops at the county level. So we have a very diverse agriculture here compared to the Midwest. Integrated pest management then is a collection of practices that builds off of, the foundation is the cropping system itself. All of the pest stuff flows out of the cropping system. Diverse cropping systems tend, from a weed management point of view, and also actually really in these commodity crops, from an insect point of view as well, as the diversity of the cropping that farmers are doing increases, the pest problem generally drops. And that's because there are inherent qualities of these crop sequences that help
so the diversity
to do the
is
control. Good. The diversity is good. As the diversity falls, we become more and more reliant on fewer and fewer tactics that we can use to manage the pest problem.
And you've said that you were a little concerned about the over-reliance, for example, of glyphosate in so many of our crops like corn and,
yes.
and alfalfa and soybean, for example.
Yes, so glyphosate is one of the herbicides. Herbicide is a kind of pesticide. Insecticides, fungicides, herbicides are all pesticides. Pesticide use in commodity crops is roughly 70% of that pesticide use are herbicides. So when we talk about commodity pesticide use, crop production pesticide use, it's overwhelmingly herbicide use.
So it's people who have a weed problem.
It's
and that's
a weed
how
problem.
Most of
it's a weed problem because
the chemicals that are introduced into our farmland is because of wanting to control weeds.
That's right. And so what's happened over the years is that we've kind of locked in through marketing and through the way in which seed and changes in the seed and pesticides have been put together in some ways that we maybe can get into in more detail later. We've increased our reliance on fewer of those pesticides. Glyphosate is one of these herbicides that's now used in our soybean production. on about 95% of the soybean acres. So it's used a lot.
So you can spray the soybean with this particular herbicide. It
Yeah.
won't affect the crop you're trying to grow, the soybeans, but it
Yeah.
will affect the invasive
That's
weed.
right, the weeds that are in the field. And initially, interestingly, back when I was younger, as a young faculty member in Nebraska, so this change in the soybean crop, it used to be that if you sprayed glyphosate on the soybean crop, it would kill the soybean crop. The soybean crop was changed genetically by introducing genes that confer resistance to glyphosate into the genome of the soybean crop.
And it works on photosynthesis, right?
Amino acids.
So it disrupts the physiology and the health of the plant. If the plant's susceptible, if the plant's not susceptible, the plant grows quite merrily along. So in 1996, these new soybeans came out. And for folks that were doing research on this in those days, I was one of those people, I think a lot of people thought it will be the soybeans that will be transformed to be resistant to glyphosate. And then we have this nice integrated approach where you then use other kinds of controls in the other crops that follow the soybean. So this summer I grow soybean, next summer I grow corn or alfalfa or something else. And the thinking was actually that trait, this resistance in the soybean to this herbicide glyphosate, would remain only in soybean. And people were a lot of people at least were thinking, yeah, that's how it will work. But actually the trait was introduced into corn. From a marketing point of view, it wasn't as though it was like a wild outcross or something. It was deliberately introduced in corn. Then it was also introduced in alfalfa.
And to farmers, this was a simple way to control, with one or two things, a simple way to control the pest problem in their fields.
It was very effective at controlling the weed problems in the fields. It enabled folks to cover more acres. It was relatively inexpensive. And so it was adopted very, widely. It's so much so, as I said a couple of minutes ago, that 95% of the soybeans grown in Pennsylvania last summer, and generally across the country,
so is that
have
a concern
this trait
to you
in it.
that has been adopted so widely?
Yeah, it's quite a big concern. Yeah, and why is it a concern? It's a concern because what has resulted from this practice is, well, first off, as the adoption increased, the choices that farmers had became more constrained because the companies were able to determine which seed lines the trait would be put in, and the seed lines then became limited to a certain suite that had this trait. And the
company that sold you the seed also sold you the pesticide or the herbicide.
The herbicide that would control the weeds. So what was the concern? The concern was that we know from the kind of work that I do that and colleagues of mine do, that we were going to be selecting for resistance, where the weedy plants that were once killed by the herbicide would, over time, evolve resistance to the herbicide and be uncontrolled by it, and that's basically what's happened.
In fact, and I'm going to take a phone call in a minute, and in fact, Penn State's Ag Science News just issued a warning to growers about Palmer amaranth, which can cause huge problems in cornfields, right? Where it can result in 91% decrease in harvest. Can you address that?
Well, actually, I just
Dr.
want to
Roush?
say that it doesn't have to happen the way it did in the United States. In fact, I moved to Australia in 1995, and within a year, colleagues I was working with at the University of Adelaide found the first herbicide-resistant weeds in the world, annual ryegrass, which is a pasture grass. And it became quite widespread in Australia long before the introduction of any GM crop. We started working on it and worked out ways that when GM crops were be introduced, you could avoid it. And we did essentially what Dave argued. It was an informal system. I was the director of the National Weed Research Center, but also had been appointed to the National Genetic Modification Regulatory Committee. And we basically said, you can't put it in two crops in the same cropping system. So even today,
basically, we're talking about unintended consequences,
that's right.
although some people anticipated that this would happen.
And we anticipated it for the United States as well on the basis of what we were doing in Australia. And a couple of us made a pilgrimage to St. Louis and talked with the companies involved and said, don't put it in corn. I mean, what Dave said is exactly
But
what
it
we're
is in
saying.
corn.
It did, but we said don't do it.
Okay.
But what we did do in Australia was we didn't put it, it was in cotton and canola, which are grown in different regions. It's been growing, we've got Roundup resistant ryegrass that was independent of canola use. Before I left Australia, my second tour there in 2006, or pardon me, in 2014, I just finished a 5-year study at looking at what was happening in canola, where we basically said, don't use it in any other crop other than the canola cycle. There was no relationship between resistance and growing of the canola. So it is possible to beat the system. The technology wasn't so bad. The problem was people didn't, you could apply it a lot more sensibly than it has been applied.
And I'm reading the 29 weed species are now resistant to glyphosate.
Yeah,
So
glyphosate, yeah.
Glyphosate,
So-
I mispronounce that all the time.
But it illustrates that, things went right off the rails. And to their credit, Monsanto actually did a pretty good job of, when we gave them advice about how to manage insect resistance, they've done a pretty good job, and there haven't been problems with that in insect-resistant crops in the United States. But they missed it with Roundup Ready.
Okay, I'm going to take a phone call and then come back to some things that maybe you're excited about that are going well. We begin now. Rhonda's calling us from State College. Go ahead, please, Rhonda.
Hi. Yeah, you're talking about weeds on a much larger scale than I'm kind of interested in. So I hope you can answer my question. I'm just wondering if Roundup is as safe as they claim that it is, and will it leave the soil in my garden clean?
So glyphosate is in Roundup, which is used at home. Who wants to address that?
Well, I think I think you shouldn't treat any herbicide as being absolutely safe, but in the grand scheme of things, compared to the toxicity of other herbicides, there's a reason why Roundup is one of the few things they let you buy in a grocery store. Relatively speaking, it's safer, but I'd still be cautious about it.
And of course, as you pointed out, David Mortensen, it is used so widely, though, because of BT crops all over the country, that who might have anticipated it would be that widespread? And I have heard that there are
that's one of
links
the problems
to cancer.
Is it because now I think the evidence of cancer is pretty weak, but certainly it's less than for other herbicides, so it still comes down to relative risk. But I mean, it was part of the reason it's been so widely used. It was safe. I mean, there are other herbicides we would like to have growers in Australia use during the rotation. They want to use glyphosate because the perception is much safer, and probably is, than the other things. The first place where we started seeing a lot of resistant weeds to Roundup in California was along irrigation banks, because Roundup was the only thing that was considered safe enough to control the weeds there, so they use it a lot. So it's it's a blessing and a curse for it, but it has it has been overused.
Okay, I'm going to go.
I guess I would also maybe I'd say that. With respect to the persistence in the soil, Rhonda, the herbicide binds to the soil quickly, which is why it's not active in the soil to kill weeds. It actually only kills weeds when it hits the leaves of the weeds in your garden. And,
so it does leave the soil clean?
Well, no. And what happens is that it does break down fairly readily. And when it was introduced and when the genetically modified crops came out in the 1996 in soybean, this was pointed to as one of the green features of glyphosate, that it didn't persist in the environment for very long. I would caution, though, that the chronic exposure to a lot of pesticides, and including glyphosate, while it's classed as safer from acute exposure, i.e., if you had a very large amount of it that you got on your skin or swallowed or something like that, it has a low acute toxicity. But there are questions about its chronic toxicity, and the International Cancer Institute has flagged it as a possible carcinogen. So my feeling with any of these pesticides is that you want to minimize your exposure as much as possible and minimize your reliance on using them as much as possible in your garden. And there are a lot of non-chemical things you can be doing before you go to the chemical option.
Do you want to?
So I'd just like to say, I spent hours as a kid cultivating corn on a diesel tractor, and it's pretty clear to me why glyphosate-resistant crops were adopted. First of all, we burn a lot of diesel cultivating corn, and also when we cultivate, we open the opportunity for more soil erosion. Glyphosate is a very, very effective herbicide that has a very low toxicity profile. And relative to cancer, I think this is a red herring. If you look at what ICAR rates as carcinogens, sausage and caffeine are in there. So
processed meat.
I'm doomed, actually. But you got to think about what herbicides it replaced. It's one of the least toxic that we have out there right now. So we're making steps in the right direction. And Dave and Rick both pointed out that herbicide-resistant weeds far predated GMOs. So this is not, we tend to get stuck in this discussion about herbicides when we talk about GMOs, but that there are many more weeds that are resistant to other herbicides than there are to glyphosate. We just have to use the technologies, things that David and his colleagues have developed and Rick and his colleagues have developed. We know how to deal with these. We just have to make sure we're doing it more effectively.
Now, you mentioned just a moment ago corn, and we have, there was a New York Times article a couple of weeks ago that said that we have sort of unwittingly genetically bred some of the nutrition out of our foods. For instance, yellow corn, the preference is for sweet white corn, but the yellow corn actually probably has 60 times more beta carotene. So I'm wondering, in the research labs, what are we looking to do? We're talking about feeding a planet that will soon be 9 billion. And it would seem to me that adding nutrition rather than flavor or sugar is certainly the goal.
Well, it's something we are looking at in the college. So we've got people in food science who are looking at things like purple potatoes.
Right, from Peru that are, right.
Yeah, have higher level of antioxidants in them. I actually think there's a potential revolution in food, that if you think about the last 10,000 years when we've been domesticating crops, we try to do things to make sure that they can be harvested easier, the seeds didn't shatter. Corn is a tour de force of breeding by people who didn't have a written language, but at least 5 major genetic changes to take it from a little grass into something that grows 9 feet tall and does all kinds of things.
A little grass with maybe 3 or 4 kernels on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the ancestor of lettuce is prickly lettuce, which has got spikes on it and latex. So we spent the last 5 or 10,000 years making things harvestable and getting rid of the really terrible tastes and toxic compounds, and we still haven't succeeded in all of them. I mean, canola seeds shatter, it's a big part of it for yield and so forth. But I think the next phase, if we can really understand what it is we want in our crops to try to design them to have more positive nutrition, that they're nutraceuticals, and we're just to the point where we can try to understand that. I mean, there are lots of claims about antioxidants and so forth. One of the postdoctoral fellows I hired at the University of Melbourne had done a study on purple carrots.
Right, which is what carrots looked like in
exactly
when they were
orange carrots are the homage to the Dutch royal family.
Right. Like orange. Some king wanted an orange carrot.
Right, but purple carrots. So she did a study and said, "Look, are these antioxidants even getting into your bloodstream?" And she found basically no. They were so tied up in the fiber of the carrot, they're basically passing through your body. So are there things we can do by crop breeding and genetic selection to loosen those things up? So if they really are
make them more bioavailable.
Make them more viable. But one of the first things to do is let's find out if try to get real evidence that they're going to be helpful before we start doing that or advertising those.
Right, interesting. I want to talk more about that, but first I want to go to Bob, who's calling us from Boalsburg. Bob, what's your question? Oh, we lost him.
We lost Bob.
Okay, I'm going to go to an email. Someone wrote to us just a moment ago and asks, should farms be held more accountable for non-point source pollution in the Chesapeake Bay? This is a tweet from Courtney. You mentioned nitrogen and keeping it out of our lakes and rivers.
Phosphorus. So that's a tough question to answer because a lot of farmers in the state are doing a really great job now. There are some that could do a lot better. But I mean, rather than sort of trying to make it a punitive thing, making them responsible, we're trying to emphasize a lot more about education. So you can look at farms around here. We've got farms that have got literally thousands of dairy cows next to pristine water sources. They clearly demonstrate that it's possible to do a really great job of this. And what I'd like to try to do is get more peer-to-peer mentoring of farmers to help them recognize the strategies and recognize they won't bankrupt them. They can adopt better strategies. Some of the problem we have with the runoff right now is from legacy use of when people did put manure out, thought they were doing the right thing, but had too much loading with phosphorus, which moves very slowly through the profile. And it'll take a long time before that changes. And at the time, people thought they were doing the right thing. As we've got better scientific understanding, we're doing a better job of managing it.
So, for example, in the College of Agriculture, we have someone in the Animal Science Department, Dr. Alex Ristoff, who has developed a technology that actually removes phosphorus from animal waste.
Unbelievable.
On a whole farm scale, and he's actually piloted this technology. So once again, for every problem that we face, there are solutions out there, and the College of Ag is heavily invested in developing those solutions.
Feed mills now very carefully adjust the ration and the feed they produce so that there's, as much as possible, no excess nutrients being fed to the animals. So we're getting better about it, and some of the fertilizer issues that are out there are legacy issues, and it's going to take time to turn those around.
Right. Okay. Let's go to Walter, who's calling us from Warren. You're on the air, Walter.
Well, first of all, Patty, thank you for taking my call.
My pleasure.
Your panelists have been talking about the relationship between genetically modified organisms and herbicides or pesticides. And it's interesting. But my concern is, being an end consumer, what effect do genetically modified soybeans or corn have on the human population? And if the human being is the end consumer and there's an intermediate consumer, say beef cattle or poultry or pork, does that intermediate consumer mitigate any deleterious effects of the genetically modified farm products?
True. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
90% of scientists say this is safe, and the consumer is still very, very concerned.
Absolutely. You look at every major scientific organization, our own regulatory agencies here in the U.S. and around the world have looked at this, and they've approved these technologies because they're safe. And there's no evidence that consuming these things has any negative health effects. Certainly, a lot of the GM crops are fed to animal. Corn and soy are fed to animal. And once again, over the last 15 to 20 years, we've actually been able to very carefully measure performance of the animals that we're eating, almost exclusively GM corn and soy. And during that period, all their production parameters, their growth rate, their health status have all improved over the last 20 years. So it's sort of like we've been able to do a 20-year-long intensive feeding trial where the animals are getting almost exclusively GM corn and soy. If we would see any negative effects, we would certainly see it there, and there has been none. And that's why they've been approved, and that's why every major scientific organization that has looked at this said that there's no evidence that there's a problem in human health.
I think when people are concerned, I think they're more concerned when it's cross-species. For example, taking a gene from a fish, for example, and inserting it into a plant to make the plant able to withstand freezing temperatures.
So that was a failed experiment. They tried doing that with strawberries a long time ago. It didn't work. And so it's not on the market. But it's important to know what the kind of changes they make. So one of the things that's out there is virus-resistant crops. And essentially what they do is they take a small piece of the virus DNA, a very small chunk, to put it into the plant, and it stimulates, in effect, a host defense response.
It's almost like a vaccine.
It's kind of like a vaccine, but it gets it all the time. And it was discovered somewhat by accident, actually, when they were trying to understand how the viruses worked and take them apart. The glyphosate-resistant crops, basically they take a gene. You could have used the gene out of petunia, a gene that's less sensitive to glyphosate than the one the soybean already has. Add that to the plant genome. The plant's gene or protein is knocked out. This other one just keeps ticking over and keeps producing amino acids that are necessary to do. So on face value, they're not enormously wide crosses. Every day we'd eat this particular thing is called EPSPS. Every day we would eat dozens of them in fruits and vegetables of a whole range of kinds. This is just one more. This is a bit different than the rest. So the European Union has looked at this. The European Union spent about $300 or $400 million evaluating GM crops for environmental safety, food safety, and concluded there's no significant difference between them. The one case where there is a difference I'd like to point out is actually in insect-resistant corn, where if anything, the corn is safer than traditionally produced.
And why?
And that's because when corn gets attacked by corn borers.
It releases a chemical.
Well, they destroy the corn kernels a bit, and they open them up, and fungal spores can land on that and grow. And one of the things the fungal spores produce is something called fumonisin, which is one of the most toxic compounds known. It's very much a human health issue. It can lead to spina bifida. For a long time in Africa, there was a high level of esophageal cancer, and it was from throat cancer. And they eventually figured out it was because of humanos in the corn people were eating. So it's an animal welfare issue. Basically, if you protect the corn kernels from being damaged by the introduction of this a bacterial gene that protects them, the kernels don't get damaged, and the levels of humanos in the corn have been recorded as much as 40-fold lower. So it's actually safer, and particularly in countries like Africa and the Philippines that have those regions that have really high levels of corn borer attack. The corn is a lot safer.
Interesting. I'm going to quickly reintroduce all of you, and then I'll take Noah. Hang on. I'll be back to get your phone call in just one moment. If you're just joining us, I'm Patty Satalia, and this is Conversations Live, The Future of Farming on WPSU. Our guests tonight are David Mortensen, Professor of Weed and Applied Plant Ecology at Penn State, Richard Rausch, Dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State, and Troy Ott, Professor of Reproductive Physiology at Penn State. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your phone calls. If you'd prefer to email us, our address is connect@wpsu.org. And now, Noah from State College, you're on the air.
Hi, Patty. Thanks for taking my call. I had a question, which is basically, if the challenge is to feed 9 billion people, shouldn't we also be talking about planting less water-intensive and herbicide-intensive crops? So basically, it seems like a lot of corn that's planted in this country is primarily planted for beef cattle feed. So if we're planting corn for beef cattle feed, maybe we're overly reliant on beef as a food source, and maybe we need to be planting more efficient and better crops that don't require such intensive water and herbicide use. Can your panel talk more about that?
Sure, that's an interesting. The corn is the prima donna of crops in terms of its need for inputs.
Yes, I think that's a great point, Noah. And I think we could take one step back further and look at the system even more broadly, but your point is well taken. And what I mean by that is when we think about the challenge that we face to feed what is 1.7 billion more people from 7.3 to 9 billion it's a challenge. There's no question about that. But there are very promising steps that we could take in the broadest sense. And let me just rattle off a couple of those things. Secretary of Agriculture for the United States, Tom Vilsack, declared a kind of an initiative back in February to reduce food waste.
30% of our food
30% of our food is thrown away. I remember being stunned when my daughter, who graduates college in a couple of weeks, and I went to her first hot lunch in kindergarten in Lincoln, Nebraska, where we lived at the time. And in our house, we have a rule that you really don't throw much of anything away. You try either save it for the next meal, or you try to take what you're thinking you're going to eat that. And we were online to put the trays up, and I think 2/3 of the chicken was thrown into the garbage can in front of us without ever having a bite taken from it. So we imagine then that 1/3 of the food, and this isn't just in the United States, how it's lost in the process differs around the world. Post-harvest losses, for example, in less well-developed countries,
right,
where
there are transportation problems.
is a problem. There are things that we can do that would make a huge dent in what is almost 1/3 of the food that is discarded. So imagine that gets us a long way down. In fact, if we made a big strides there, we would meet the food demands of 2050. Also, as Noah points out, if we made adjustments in our diet and didn't have so much of our food going through animals or going to ethanol, many studies have been conducted that we could actually double the amount of calories available for human consumption which would, again, more than meet the food demands of 2050. And several folks that I've been working with have been doing some projections on how some of these adjustments actually get us way down the road to meeting these demands without ever even calling on it, huge increase in crop production.
But the irony to me is that there are actually more obese people, overweight people on the planet today than undernourished. So there's another issue to tackle. We're going to go now to Bob. I think he's calling us back from Boalsburg. Go ahead, please, Bob.
I have a couple comments and a question, and that is that one is that the promise of GMOs may have been oversold in that what we know is that whether or not you want GMOs, I believe that consumers should have the opportunity to make a choice. That's number one. But more importantly, that the unequivocal fact is that the use of genetically modified crops have resulted in the overspraying and increased spraying of herbicides, and the impacts on human health of glyphosate, Roundup, and other chemicals, while they may be deemed the least dangerous, are a constant threat to human health. So I'd ask all of you to address the impact, most importantly, on human health, and secondarily, the creation of superweeds.
Okay, Troy Ott.
So I'll come back to the health thing. we can say pretty unequivocally that there is no evidence right now. And when we talk in science, we talk about evidence, scientific data that would suggest that the use of these compounds are causing problems with human health. And that's a fairly straightforward
I
statement.
read something from the World Health Organization, their cancer research arm, that says that there is the possibility of a link of this cancer thing that a couple of our callers are asking about.
Yeah, and we touched on that before, and they talk about a hazard. So right now, if you were standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, you might fall in and die. That's a hazard. But we're here in Pennsylvania, so the risk is very low. And the difference between risk and hazard is what's confusing people. Okay? So at the consumption and exposure levels that we see chronically, there is no evidence that the risk of this particular herbicide is any worse than any of the other ones that have ever been used. And in fact, in some cases, because it's less toxic, there's actually less risk. And that's why these things have been adopted widely. So this idea that there are health effects of consuming these crops that we should be worried about is just not supported by science.
Okay, and so the other parts of his question.
And I can't remember.
Yeah.
And superweeds. I'd like to take that because that's immediately in my area of study. I also would like to talk a little bit more about the safety issues, and I think that we have to look at this in a broad and holistic way. One of our Pennsylvania-born writers, Daniel Charles, authored a book, Lords of the Harvest, where he talked about how it is that there's been this enormous aggregation in large companies where seed companies were bought up by the input companies. So the input companies are the ones that are selling things like herbicides and insecticides. When I started 30 years ago as a young faculty member in Nebraska, there were over 200 seed corn breeding companies in Nebraska alone.
And now there are only about 6 major companies.
And now there are 6 major companies that own 71% of the seed and input sales globally. And that's pretty much the case in the United States as well. So what we've seen is a packaging of seed that has been altered to enable the use of the pesticide products that go along with it. In the case of the herbicides, you're altering the genome of the crop in order to enable the use of the herbicide. And as Troy said, the herbicide is effective, so it's been something that's been adopted. as we've done that, we've increased the amount of the things that we're using then. So in the case of glyphosate, when we began this in 1996, we were using 4,000 tons of glyphosate. We now use 40,000 tons of glyphosate.
And are we creating super weeds?
And we are creating weed problems that are resistant to the glyphosate herbicide that now infest about 40% of the corn and soybean acres across the United States. So it's not a little problem, and whether we call that a super problem or not. In my view, and I've argued this in congressional testimony and other places, this is very unique. While it is true that weeds have evolved resistance back into the late 70s, there's evidence of this, and these GMO herbicide-resistant crops came on in the mid-90s. What's different and what is unique is that the crops have been bred to be resistant to the herbicide so that the herbicide goes with the seed now, and that the practice, there are all sorts of market incentives then where the seed is discounted, the herbicide's discounted, they go together and you use them together.
Your printer and your inkjet cartridge.
Right. And then as we've selected for resistance then, what we are now doing, we did last year with one company's product, seed product, and right now there's one where there's call for public comment on another company who's put a gene in for resistance to a new herbicide, dicamba, that doesn't have such a healthy environmental profile. It's a chlorinated aromatic ring compound. So that you would be controlling the resistance problem by spraying glyphosate and dicamba, that most of the time is going to be sold in a product.
So he said what's happening is we are actually in some cases using more.
We are definitely using more herbicides by about a third now than we were before we started this. And let me just finish, please, because this is my field of study. We've increased it by a third over what we were using before the crops came online. And with the resistance now, the projection is by most folks, and our lab has made this projection and others have around the country, and our projections have been used by the USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Service and the EPA in the review of these crop seeds, that we're looking at a 2 to 3-fold increase in herbicide use over the next 5 to 10 years.
Wow.
To control the problem.
Okay, comment, and then I'm going to go to Jim. I'll let you, Dean Roush.
Troy mentioned earlier, there are a lot of other previous cases of herbicide resistance. So glyphosate resistance is on the rise, but previous herbicides, for example, the sulfonylureas, they were also, by classical breeding, canola and other crops were produced that are resistant, so-called clear field, are resistant to sulfonylureas. I don't know the stats in the Western United States.
But I get the difference is that this is so widespread.
No, but I don't know what the stats are in the Western United States, but virtually every acre in the wheat belt of Australia has sulfonylurea-resistant weeds in it. Far more widespread than anything you can see. I mean, literally just about every acre has resistance. So in some areas, when the clearfield crops were introduced to Australia, they failed in the first year because the resistance was widespread. There are many other herbicides that are out there. One of the differences is sulfonylureas get used at much lower rates. So as soon as you switch to something like glyphosate, the volume is higher. The sulfonylureas are sufficiently persistent that you had to be careful what you planted the next year. As Dave said earlier, glyphosate's not such a problem. 10 million hectares, 20 million acres of southern Australia basically gets treated once with Roundup immediately after the first rains. People direct drill the crop the next day. One of the things this has meant is they get far lower wind erosion, far greater soil water conservation.
So there are costs and benefits here.
There are costs, and this
Always
example
are.
of costs. On a global basis, it's estimated that Roundup-ready crops have probably reduced CO2 emissions in the atmosphere from plowing, from disturbing the soil, and from the exhaust of the tractors themselves by something greater than 20 billion pounds. It's a huge number in terms of the advantages from reduced tillage. And it's true that herbicides get used, but I just want to go on one other point. While I was the director of the Weeds Research Center in Australia, what became a real message for me is the future of weed control is probably not herbicides, it's increasing the competitiveness of crops. And the thing that sort of astonished me is that there are GM canola varieties that are hybrid varieties. They are created by GM technology. Not many people talk about these, they forget about them, but they're hybrids created by GM technology, and you can look at them in the field and they outgrow the weeds. I could show you photos of cases in Canada where typically they would make 2 applications of Roundup on a growing canola crop. They make 1 application on the hybrids. Gets the weeds under control a bit, and the crop just outgrows the
Of course,
weeds.
then there's this issue of evolution and second generation
Well,
GM crops, but
I mean, this is an example. I think there's a future here, and it's shown by this, to use GM technology to get away from herbicides altogether. I think Dave is right. I think that these ideas of stacking these herbicide resistance were dumb. They were dumb. They probably won't work actually for some resistance management purposes.
You wanted to add something,
just
Dr.
2
Robb?
quick points. One is, if you look on the insecticide side, we have greatly reduced spraying of insecticides, particularly in corn and soy and other things, because of BT crops. So there's been a great reduction in the use of insecticides. And then I want to talk a little bit about the consolidation. If you think about...
Of the companies, of the agribusinesses.
If you think about any sort of endeavor that humans are in, over the last 50 years, we have consolidated greatly. So whether it's media, or whether it's manufacturing, or whether it's phones and computers, everything has consolidated. And those consolidations have brought increased efficiency, they've driven costs
and
down.
also concerns.
And some concerns, but that's why everyone's walking around with some sort of a smartphone in their pocket that has more technology in it than went up on the initial Apollo missions, because of consolidation, efficiencies, and bringing costs down and making these things available to the general public. So there are real benefits to these, and the same technology that brought these, let's say they brought these problems on, also have the solutions to those problems. So we understand how to deal with resistance over time, and so the same technology that was used maybe to create a little bit of overuse also has a chance to solve the problem.
Except
as well.
that when sometimes it's a second generation GM crop, I think of that, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result.
Right.
You're going to have the same resistance, and I want to get to some phone calls.
But we have had some really great successes as well.
Okay, so we'll go to Jim. Jim, thank you for your patience. You're on the air.
Thank you. I would like the panel to address the climate effects of the greenhouse gases emitted due to conventional agriculture, from the production of agrochemicals, the methane emissions from concentrated animal feeding operations, to the decline in carbon sequestration in soils conventionally farmed, just to name 3.
Okay.
Doesn't this impact the future of industrial conventional farming?
Professor Ott?
I'll start with the animal side, and I'll let these gentlemen handle the plants. In 1940, we had roughly 27 million dairy cows in the U.S., 27 million. And today we have a little over 9 million. So we have about a third of the number of dairy cows. And those dairy cows, those 9 million dairy cows, are producing 2/3 more milk. So if you want to think about sustainability, we're producing 2/3 more milk with 1/3 the number of cows. And I could give you very similar statistics if we were talking about beef or poultry or swine production as well. So the technologies, by improving the diets of the animals, they reach market weight or production weight sooner, and when they get there, they're much more productive. Whenever you become more efficient, you become more sustainable. So if you think about sustainability, at least on the livestock side, we become tremendously more sustainable by using these technologies.
Can you talk about the climate change part of it? And then I want to go to Bob and
Sure.
Dorothy.
I mean, the big climate change actors are nitrous oxide coming off nitrogen fertilizer use, tillage of soil. This 20 billion pounds I talked about, there's only about 2 billion pounds of it for reduced fuel use. The other 18 billion is for not turning the soil over and exposing carbon in the soil to be released. So major advances for agriculture around the world have been increased adoption of reduced to no tillage, being able to direct drill crops. For better or worse, herbicides have played a role in that, controlling the weeds without tillage. So, there's a trade-off involved. But yeah, the trends are going. I mean, one of the big things that's happening in the GM crop era is that people have worked out ways for improved nitrogen use efficiency in crops. They get by on half the amount of nitrogen.
And cover crops eat up that nitrogen, so if people just use cover crops, they can help reduce
There's
nitrogen.
a $1 trillion problem there in terms of how to use nitrogen more efficiently and not having it go in the atmosphere in the rivers and streams.
Okay, I'm going to go to Bob from Boalsburg. Go ahead, please, Bob.
So I'd like to follow up on the fact that glyphosate and Roundup were originally intended as weed control, but now are being used as green burned down and directly applied to crops just before harvest, particularly in lentils and wheat. And so I would ask if anyone is studying the impact on human health of the direct application of glyphosate to food products immediately prior to harvest.
Okay, we'll go to you, Dr. Mortensen.
Yeah, Bob, those kinds of uses of herbicides are what are in application parlance referred to as harvest aid applications. So they're made very late to defoliate the crop or accelerate the dry down of the crop so that the grain dries and is easier to harvest. There are very rigorous tests done looking at residues of late applications of that kind on the lentils or other crops. It's used in cotton as well as a defoliant.
So quickly, is it a concern?
Is it a concern? I think that the safety testing on residues in that case shouldn't be a concern in that kind of use.
We're going to real quickly try to go to Dorothy from Boalsburg, so make your question quick, and I will get to our panelists as quickly as we can. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I'm interested in the sequestration of carbon in soil by using cover crops and other more organic ways of farming than are allowed by the GMO approach, the Green Revolution approach to soils, which has been more of a chemical approach.
Dean Roush.
So,
Look, my own view is the future of agriculture, if it's really sustainable, take the best technologies from a whole range of disciplines. They'll include using organic practices for soil management, judicious use of some pesticides under particular circumstances. You really have to look at the whole package, and the future of agriculture will look much more like a hybrid that doesn't really exclude any technology, but looks at it on their merits.
And if you think about what we've been doing in the College of Ag, we have a couple of researchers who have developed what's called the interseeder, which allows them to seed the cover crop over top of corn. And so this is a great advance, and this mechanism is being adopted widely as a way to make more effective use of cover crops.
I'm going to ask our producers if I can take another phone call. Okay, Paul from Clearfield, go ahead, please.
Yes, in 1965, I was invited to a country called Vietnam, where I was told somewhat of the same thing I'm hearing tonight, that herbicides and et cetera was not harmful. We sprayed all the jungles of Vietnam, and I'm sitting in Clearfield, the product of Agent Orange. It's hard for me to believe that we're not creating it again, and I know you gentlemen are very well educated, et cetera, but be careful. We went through this once before, and I don't want to see us go through it again. Thank you so very, very much. Take care.
Thank you for your call.
If
Any
I can
comments?
just address that
Please.
quickly. Agent Orange had a compound called 2,4,5-T. When you manufacture 2,4,5-T, you can get small amounts of dioxin. Dioxin is a carcinogen. The component that's being used in herbicides is 2,4-D. You cannot make dioxin with 2,4-D. The chemical structure doesn't allow that. So we know the chemistry fairly well. And this is one of those things where they often conflate Agent Orange with 2,4-D, and it's too much chemistry and people don't want to think about it. But 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D are different, and 2,4-D is safer.
Okay, Dean, ask your question quickly and I'll have one of our panelists answer it. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was calling about the herbicides also, and what you think it's doing to the water supply overall, being that it's herbicides are not only used on crops, but in industrial areas everywhere, golf courses, oil refineries, along our roadsides. It's being used everywhere, and I was just wondering what you thought it's doing to the water supply.
All right, thank you, Dean. We'll start with you with just a couple of minutes remaining.
Yeah, so quickly, one of the things, Dean, that we know, and this is something that I've spent a lot of time looking at over the last 5 years or so, is as we increase the amount that we use and as we increase the area that we apply them to, we increase the detects of the compounds in surface water, drinking water, streams, etc. I, for my entire career, have been focusing on reducing dramatically or working on systems that would reduce dramatically the reliance on the use of herbicides in agriculture at any scale. The data are compelling from the U.S. Geological Survey that as you increase the amount we use and the area that we treat, the amount that we see and the frequency that we see it in the drinking water and in all sort of water systems increases. Your point is well taken, and we need to be very careful about any steps that we take in the farming that we do and in the way that we handle these things, that we try to not increase the area treated or amount used.
In 30 seconds, Dr. Mortensen, what are you doing in your lab that gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope for the future is the bright young people that are coming to Penn State and other places, PASA that I work with, and their drive to identify ways that we do a better job with the farming that we do from an ecological point of view.
Dean Roush.
I was thinking the same thing, bright students we get, but increasingly, the more and more I see that farmers are willing to try to really think outside the box, so minimize their impact on the environment as well.
And I would
Dr.
come back
Rott.
to Dean Roush's comment about an all options approach. We need to have many tools in the toolbox to meet these challenges, and so we're going to use all these options. And I like that our young people are focused on sustainability, and that's where we need to go with agriculture.
All right, thank you all so very much for being with us. Our guest tonight, Dr. David Mortensen, Professor of Weed and Applied Plant Ecology at Penn State, Dr. Richard Roush, Dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State, and Dr. Troy Ott, Professor of Reproductive Physiology at Penn State. I'm Patty Satalia. For all of us here at WPSU, thanks for joining us. Have a good night.